Hi, and welcome. My name is Andrew Bernier. This is my submission for the 2017 Graduate College Impact Awards, Leading Through Knowledge and Engagement and Innovation. The presentation I'll be giving to you today for my submission is Complexity and Knowledge Mobilization, how adapting the dynamics of living systems in learning design models can tell great stories of sustainability. So a lot of what I'm going to present to you today is a recap of what my doctoral work was, which predominantly focused in the field of sustainability education. In my time here as a postdoctoral scholar at the Walton Sustainability Solutions Initiatives, which is part of the School of Sustainability and the Global Institute of Sustainability, I've been focusing more on ideas of circular economy, storytelling, and also now knowledge mobilization, how those can be integrated into greater concepts of sustainability education. And so at the end, I'm going to be presenting you a conceptual model that I hope is worthy of consideration. Okay, so getting into it, the norm of a lot of education that I've worked with, and having been a school teacher for 6 years and now even teaching at ASU, we find that there's a lot of kind of traditional industrial structures at play. These are well documented through many fields, and this was all designed to promote the Industrial Revolution. These are categorized in Frederick Taylor's Scientific Principles, which came out over a century ago when the height of the Industrial Revolution was coming to play, and we needed factory workers for these emerging industrial industries. Not too long ago, I was fortunate enough to travel to Japan, where I was part of a group of teachers on a Fulbright exchange, looking at sustainability in some of the schools that are taking place there. And as I was looking at their schools, I kept thinking about this construct that's relevant in education, this idea of this linear process of an introduction, a concept, and skills. You have the teaching and learning process. Once the product is put out, you have the desired product, and then there's a learning outcome, which is either achieved or not achieved, so then the teacher provides feedback in that process. And no matter how good or poorly, there might be some time to revisit it, but we gotta kind of have to keep going on, much like a conveyor belt in industrial structures. So when I was in Japan, and these were some of the schools that were being promoted as top-of-the-line sustainability schools, this was the image that I saw, was a lot of the same straightforward linear processes. Now, of course, there were exceptions to this rule, but this was by far the prevailing scene that I saw at what was touted to be some of the most advanced sustainability programs. And so when we look at what this idea of this linear structure does, there's a couple deficiencies to it. So it's rigid. A lot of linear processes are very rigid. When you have rigidity in structure, they are more prone to disruption. Either it's a fast, and then a break. You oftentimes have a lot of top-down power. So in this case, a teacher instructing a student. It's basically dependent upon one force pushing information or matter or energy through to the other side of a linear system. There's a singular path, and there's a particular load capacity. Electricity works in this way, whereas if you were to overload a line beyond its capacity to handle electricity, for instance, it's going to short out. There's not much different when it comes to a student, and that if you overload a student who may or may not be ready at a given time for a particular concept, you might overload that student and you'll get burnout. And also linear processes create a lot of waste. And so waste manifestation in education is in the form of time, resources, and talent. And as we're trying to cram teachers, curriculums, students, whole educational processes through linear constructs, which were designed for the Industrial Revolution, we do have large quantities of these wastes that come about. So there is an alternative to linear structures, but I thought about, do we still even want to model education after the economies that we want, which was what was done at the beginning of the 20th century. So what economies do we want? And I've been looking more into ideas of the circular economy. And so the graphic you see here is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. A lot of wonderful work happening out of there about how we can continuously keep physical resources in industrial loops. So that way we can kind of get away from traditional industrial extraction, cradle to grave processes, if you will, and that we can keep material flowing as indefinitely as we possibly can. So the graphic here I composed, and this potential, it's a working theory at the moment, is how, say, the circular economy can also be intertwined with these other emerging economies, such as leaving the agricultural and the industrial economies, now getting from information to knowledge and network-based, maybe even to then passion and sharing and purpose economies. So how is it that the physical circular economies can then fuel the advancement of the human intellect, the knowledge processes in the emerging economies that are based no longer off of what we can do with our hands, but what is it that we're doing with our minds, and also in relation with one another as well. And so to achieve this, what are the skills and knowledge needed to realize this economy shift from these linear-based economies to these more circular economies? What type of educational settings or structures are going to be needed to then realize this shift? So if linear structures run rampant for industrial economies, which are going away, such as steel, coal, manufacturing, we're trying to move larger populaces to these circular economies. How are we going to prepare people for this in an educational setting? So when we think about what this idea of circular, we have these feedback loops, and we get this idea of systems. And so the structure of systems, there's benefits to it. It's a bit more complicated, but there is what we find a lot more flexibility within systemic design. So you have diversity in different components that are within the structure. Adaptivity in healthy systems allow for resilience and be able to have to bounce back from disruptions or change shape and structure in light of changing environments. And there's mutual input opportunity as well. So as opposed to just top-down structure, you have kind of more of a multi-directional input. So maybe there's also more bottom-up as opposed to just top-down influence in terms of moving information and matter through a system. You also have multiple paths, which then go into this idea of path of least resistance. And so when a student is faced with one option or three options, there's a form of empowerment in which we have students that are able to pick an option and then get momentum going through a system to them maybe that they are going to achieve all of the things, whereas if they're only given one shot, that might be too much for them to succeed past. And then we have the elimination of waste. So most natural processes and systems actually don't have waste. There might be outputs, but that also might be designed to be resources for a different conjoining system. And so where there's no waste in nature, as opposed to, say, the cradle-to-grave design structures, we get to know what's called cradle-to-cradle design. And we even get a more advanced idea of upcycling, whereas as opposed to, say, assignments being one and done or concepts being forgotten over time, there's much more intention of repurposing and upcycling, actually almost maintaining, if not improving, the quality of assignments as opposed to submission and then cast along. How amazing would it be if you could revisit an assignment and continuously improve it as more concepts are introduced to a student? So when we think about the two, these two structures, based as linear or system-based structures, information has to flow through any system. So if we want to develop, say, resilient people in a more knowledgeable society, which structure would you choose? One is what has run rampant for the last century, and one is maybe the processes that have been at play in the natural world for, say, 3.8 billion years. So I want to bring you to what led me to a lot of my doctoral research. I was a K-12 teacher, a secondary teacher at the Center for the Research in Engineering, Science, Technology, the CREST program, and focusing particularly on their sustainability branch. And there, I developed curriculum that worked with students in hands-on technology, community-based application. We got to develop original, unique curriculum for what was a career and technical education program. So book work, theoreticals, hands-on, we ran the gamut. And here are a couple pictures here of my students working in the field. But as I was going through curriculum that was given to me, a lot of them followed that same linear structure. So as I was going through about my research processes, I kept thinking, is there an alternative to linear structures for curriculum design, specifically for sustainability? If so, what does that look like, and where can we find it? So I've already established that there's this juxtaposition between linear and systems, so I went down that path. But I still had to teach a whole bunch of whatnot to my students. And so when I started getting into this idea of systems thinking, one of the real basic quotes from Donnell Meadows, who's a renowned systems theorist, is that a system must have three kinds of things. You got elements, you have interconnections, and you have a purpose. These three kinds of things lend themselves to the creation of a system. So I'm going to start with the elements, the stuff, the what, the parts. And I essentially went into competencies. Now, competencies are essentially a joining of knowledge and skill sets. They don't tend to be as much, but for what I'm going to show you, I had to break these down for my students and my administrators and my teachers and parents so that there was a bit more conveyance, if you will, and ease to understand about what exactly I wanted the students to learn over the time that I had with them. And so I broke them down into several categories. The first are content, and so in this one you'll see they're clumped into different courses. And so you have water and food, you have ecosystems, you have materials and technology, and I wanted the students to pick up each one, and I gave each one of these a little code that you'll see, such as SEC7. So that's the what, the content of knowing. Then there's the research processes. I wanted my students to be able to be, inquisitive and conduct proper inquiry and the scientific process. And so there was research competencies, the theoreticals, which were specific to sustainability. This was kind of the uniqueness, if you will, of what sustainability was trying to convey. And here are the competencies that make sustainability a unique field. And then participation, how much are they engaging not just with each other in class, but also getting out into the community. Application, so this is a skill set, the specific skills that I designed and sought that a sustainability change agent, a social change agent needs to have, and coupled with knowledge of theoreticals. And then also there's the idea of community. So this was also their engagement processes as well. Okay. So research methodology, how to measure students' learning and interconnections of competency. So this is basically the process of my dissertation work. I only had 13 students, and so I originally wanted to do an experimental design of students with the curriculum and without the curriculum, but I didn't have that many students to make that happen. And so then I decided to do a triangulated data set where we had dichotomous rubrics via mixed media, phenomenological blogging through narrative chronology, so storytelling, and also we did interviews and transcription processes based off of meetings with the students. So I'll get into that a little bit. Okay, so basically the making of relationship-based assessment on a linear timeline, so the dichotomous rubric scoring. These are now the development of the interconnections behind to connect all the individual parts. And so I used a dichotomous rubric, which essentially uses different qualifiers over time. Basically, you look at the different assignments that were given and were they complete, and yes, somewhat no, based off of these different qualifiers on step one. And then you make your determination, go to step two, and then you figure out, okay, how well is the student able to articulate and explain. So for instance, did they walk the walk with the assignments? And now are they talking the talk through their ability to articulate it? And now step three was the competency category specific determinant. And if you notice that for the content and theoreticals, this grade determined how well they were able to explain a competency in relationship to other competencies. So as opposed to discussing a competency in isolation, it was more about how well they were interconnecting competencies, how well they were explaining the relationships between them as opposed to one in singularity. And once we did that, we determined the score so that the grade stayed congruent with the grading structure for the district that the research was done in. And so I was working on a linear timeline as well. So this was the dissemination of how the pacing was going to go from each semester. Now this was only done with the students for their junior year. So this was for their energy and materials technology class. But if I had all 4 years of the student, this would be the pace in which it would go. So some modification would need to be done if it were to be installed in other classes. So I thought about this, okay, I now have the parts and I have the interconnections, but what is this going to look like? If you look behind this quote here from Fritjof-Capra, you start to see these dots and interconnections. So it looks like a network map. And so this idea of mapping is critical. So in this quote, in the study of structure, we measure and weigh things. Patterns, however, cannot be measured or weighed. They must be mapped. So to understand a pattern, we must map a configuration of relationships. So when we think about student and human behavior, if you will, these are patterns over time, and how well we can really look at and analyze these learning patterns of systems thinking. And so I thought to myself, okay, nature's done systems pretty well, and they're always adapting and always evolving to, say, environmental stressors. So this idea of biomimicry now comes into play, which is gaining a lot of traction, even has an institute here at ASU. Biomimicry being an approach to innovation that seeks sustainable solutions to human challenges by emulating nature's time-tested patterns and strategies. So most of what biomimicry has been applied to so far has been industrial design. It could be architectural, it could be product design, and so forth. I'm wondering now, how can we do it for educational design? So looking at how we do pedagogical approaches, curriculum assessment, other assessment items. Can biomimicry be applied to human learning and how we design for it? So I started sketching it out, and interestingly enough, it started to look a lot like an organic molecule. And so the molecule I have here is simple. It's sugar. It's simple sugar. And this is present all over in biology, and it is the main molecule that really helps provide energy to biological structures. And so I was like, okay, I can work with this for a little bit. And so as we went through the data and the research, I started to kind of blow up this idea and develop the organic molecule model of how I actually want to visualize my student systems thinking. And this was the original concept that I came up with. And so what you see here is the carbon, if you will, the carbon backbone of organic molecule. And these are the content competencies, and branched off of it, kind of like like hydrogen and oxygen, are the application, the research, and the theoretical competencies based off of how a student works on it over time. And so I tried it, and I looked at my middle student, I looked at my lowest student, and I looked at my highest student. And I tried to map out how well they were identifying and how well they were choosing the competencies to be assessed on, self-assessed on. And so when we look at one particular competency here, this one is theoretical 14, or just transitions. This student scored an 8.7, pretty good, and they were able to map out 4 different competencies in relation to this one to show that systems thinking. My lowest student, who got a C at the time, you can see it's a very small molecule. He didn't come in and do a lot of scoring. I chose this one randomly at a score of 6.8, where he only connected 2 different competencies to SMT4, which was sustainable transportation. But when we look at my most robust student, who came in at 93.35%, so A, you can see a much more robust molecule having developed. And she came in repeatedly, she tried for more assessment items, and just to give you an idea of how robust or how interconnected one score is, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different competencies in relation to this competency, which was sustainable waste management. And that score of 9.1 was the score determined on the dichotomous rubric. And so there is a limitation to this model, though. Not all the carbon, the C content, was part of each meeting, so I couldn't have that binding to that carbon backbone, if you will, a content backbone. And so it also still followed that linear format as content was introduced over time, so students were essentially waiting, if you will, until they felt appropriately ready for something to come up. So I thought about, how can we play with this, still staying the biomimicry? So we have the strength of connections that are not equal. And so, one connection can be really strong, and students get that, and some are not. So I looked at chemical bonds, and you have single, double, and even rarely triple bonds. And also, another aspect that comes in threes is the triple bottom line and sustainability. One of the absolute core prerequisite understandings of sustainability that most students, young students, know right off the bat. This idea of what is social, economical, and ecological connections to be made. So I thought, maybe I can bring these three together to better reflect what these interconnections look like. And so I decided to blow up the molecules, to get bigger. And when we go from molecules and we think about life, we get to this idea of the cell. And so I kind of run on the assumption, let's think about all the theoreticals, the research, and the application competencies as being already present, but not, say, tapped into just yet. And then over time, as content is introduced into a student and they start to come in to be assessed on content, the inside of the cell starts to form, like the organelles, if you will, start to come to fruition. And you can start to see how weak or how strong the interconnections are becoming. And then over time, we get to see the inside of the cell becoming even more robust. How well these competencies are connecting together from, say, content to content, but also how well the content, the knowledge, if you will, is starting to bind to the more skill-based competencies that a student needs to be a robust sustainability change agent. So, as content knowledge enters the cell, it starts binding with these other skill-based competencies. And then, when we think about the interconnections, students start to reinforce these relationships, and we do this through any smart pedagogical practice, collaborative learning, community-based projects, hands-on techniques, using technology. But we got to shift it so that they are problem and product-based. So how we think about as getting away from, say, we have problems for solutions and product development. What is the thing that our students are developing? And that's what is going to get us to sustainability solutions. And so in this model connection here, we show resilience and thrivability connecting with energy transmission. But here's where things really start to get interesting, especially for systems thinking, is that we want to have students are complex. Students are complex adaptive systems. And when you have complex systems, we have emergence. And this is the unique thing that we just don't know is what's going to happen when we start to put pieces together. So when we think about when students start systems thinking and making these interconnections, they're not going to be the same from each student. Linear processes kind of expect the same quality from each student as they're put into a system, but systems allows for this idea of diversity per student, and it's the relationships that they form that is the emergent property that makes each one unique. So as we treat these things as emergent properties, we need to capture them, and we do this in story. And this is where knowledge mobilization is really going to start taking form at its core. So we zoom into what these interconnections are, and we start to realize that when we generate knowledge, we often rely on empirical research data. So we have data, statistics. We use these things as support, which is fine for the limited populations who understand the language and how to read the data and the different methods that get us there. But when we think about what connects most of us, we have relatable lived experiences. This is how the vast majority of the public operates. And so when we want to disseminate knowledge and information, oftentimes it's done through storytelling. And so it's what's going to make knowledge and information more accessible. And this is not an attempt to dumb down empirical knowledge. We can honor this, but we need to make this knowledge, and this is the whole point of knowledge mobilization, more accessible, more memorable, and for most people, more meaningful. And so I like to think that storytelling is going to be what I call the most common denominator. It is the thing that can connect us, most people. But we have to do it articulately, and we have to do it in such a way that honors the data and honors the science and research. And so when we think about knowledge mobilization, it's this intentional messaging that weaves together knowledge and skills to enact change. And so when I think about common denominators and super zoomed in on what is biological processes, we're at DNA. And it is now, looking at this structure, it is this weaving together, say, skills and knowledge, and we have little phosphate strands, and they start to weave together, which is all fun. But when we think about storytelling, and I was looking at the side profile of the DNA strand here, the double helix, I started thinking about a storytelling technique that I used a while ago, and so I'm going to blow it up a little bit. But if we look at it, you have the width, if you will, of the strand being scale, as in the more narrow, the more personal it might be, but then also the more wide, the more, say, macro scale it becomes. And then as you go down the strand, that's over time. And so, of course, stories have to follow timelines. And so I thought to myself, we should begin stories for knowledge dissemination with the introduction to a person or a group in a particular setting. And you would connect, say, what is the struggle or what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and give it a little bit of a familiar emotional tug. So we have initial ideas that can latch onto who it is that we're trying to connect with. And then we blow that up to that little personal struggle to the bigger picture of what is the big problem that we're trying to solve. What is the big solutions that are needed? And so as opposed to starting with big picture and overwhelming people, start with an emotional context that can allow people to be a part of the process. And then in the middle, we kind of zoom back into the individual or the group, and this begins the journey. So the journey of the research process. What were the small steps being made? How can we highlight the small wins in the progress, but also pay attention and honor the setbacks and the small failures that basically create the drama, if you will. All research is not seamless. We have to be able to convey that science is not this flawless process, that there is kind of some human struggle, especially if we're trying to take on social biological issues in the world. And so when we think about and start to identify the knowledge and skills that are being used, but also identified as needing to be acquired, we can then kind of go back to the bigger picture and how much of this research process or the product being developed, how big, if you will, how many of these journeys do we need to realize and solve the big picture problem? Or are there even other examples of it that other people are taking on? And we go back in and we zoom back on, is there victory? Have we achieved victory? Or do we at least know that we're on the path to get there? And what is that change looking like? And so the question is, when people have encountered your story, have they become empowered to join the story, to make their own story, to move forward on it? And so, oftentimes we only have one shot to communicate and relay our message with people. So we can entice people with story. But we also want to make sure that we give our audience some facts, and this is the research to educate them and that they can walk away with to being more informed citizens and practitioners, potentially, of your research. And then leave them, and this is important, with the empowerment, this is the inspiration that, I can do it, that they can learn more and maybe even replicate their change. So, when students, for instance, in this instance, go through assignments and are developing stories of the work that they're processing, then we have to develop relationship-focused digital assignments. I'm really big into digital media that leave the cell, if you will, and that goes to audiences beyond the teacher and other students. So as we do education and we do research and we do genuine work either at the K-12 level and for the research I would love to do at the higher ed level, to be much more intentional about sharing the knowledge and getting out in such a ways that are easily discernible, particularly in digital media formats. And this, if you will, the final kind of piece that Donella Meadows calls for is the purpose. Assignments should not be just for teachers and students' eyes. They should be meant to be shared. And that is a skill and a quality that needs to be conveyed down the road. So I'm going to close here with the next steps needed for the research I'm hoping to do. So with that, I want to get more into computer modeling, and there's our groups on ASU's campus, some of which I've talked to, about potentially doing network mapping and doing agent-based modeling for development of these curriculums. For almost as soon as you plug in a number, can it then populate on a digital model? I need to test this with students of various academic settings, abilities, scales, and levels. I had a small subset of honors levels high school students. I needed to do this at larger university classes. I can do this at graduate courses. This needs to be able to see if it can work in multiple student settings. And then, once we get some additional data in the testing, we can start working with the packaging and organization about how we can make this tool, if you will, of a digital systems thinking model more apt to be understood by educators and for ease of implementation into classrooms and even school districts and universities as a whole. And then my ultimate goal, my dream would be to develop physical models that represents a student's system thinking. How cool would it be if you actually were able to say 3D print or assemble a model that can showcase how a human being systems thinks? Where are the gaps and the strong points, the densities of interconnections of how people connect and don't connect ideas. And we can use that as a tool to help them think about next steps and where their interest lies by seeing how it is that they connect the dots. So I'd like to close there. It's a pretty simple approach. It's a shift in perspective in that, well, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And again, my name is Andrew Bernier, and I appreciate the time. Thanks.